Bless God and greetings. Right now, I would like to take a thorough look at food laws in the scriptures and to see different things that we can get before, during, and after the Mosaic covenant pertaining to diet, and in particular, of course, animals. Now, with some of the other arguments that Judaizers bring forth, we know that Jesus did it this way too, even when the Mosaic law was enforced, is that he demanded common logic and reason from those that would try to pose him problems. And so now we have to look at aptitude and predisposition. When we analyze a situation, okay? So, for example, the one thing Jesus said, I was thorough with this saying in the prior video surrounding the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. One basic way to interpret that is to understand that God didn't make man because the Sabbath was already there. Okay? Rather that the Sabbath came later, which would mean that everything that was there with man vindicated all his actions on the Sabbath day, such as doing good on the Sabbath. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Well, there's a law there before Sabbath law, and that law that was there was to do good, then of course it must be lawful to do good on the Sabbath day, because God wouldn't add a law for what is bad. Okay. And then we just see how different Sabbath keepers, whatever, they make their own Sabbath. So they have the whole thing in reverse of what Jesus was speaking. And they're real heavy on guilt, such as what was there being condemned by Jesus in the first century, even when the Mosaic law was enforceable, falling under the same type of persuasions, okay? And no doubt the same with the food laws. There is two tiers here of intuition that you can't avoid when it comes to the food laws that were in Israel that started with the Mosaic covenant and ended at the cross. I mean, there's two levels deep on this. Okay, so I'll talk about that. And then I'll look at the differences, because when we talk about food, everything's based off of what God is ordering. Okay, the two-tiered situation went with the flow of how God gave an origin in the Garden of Eden, which then goes on with the intuition. And then we have these specific orders that God is giving and how they don't bounce around frantically without any jurisdiction and reliability on his part. But there is moving around with it because of different things, okay? And then things that we can glean from to connect things. So then when the Judaizers want to come in with a verse, and the real text that they're going to use is Isaiah 65 and 66. I can't think of much else. I mean, going to Leviticus 11, I mean, it's going to be something they rely on, of course, because they say, well, it's Mosaic law. Some people have this idea that Mosaic law is eternal, or it's Mosaic law, so, you know, Jesus didn't come to destroy, but to fulfill, and fulfill doesn't mean he took that away, because it becomes more of a golden calf for them, maybe food laws. Some other things is not as convenient for them, okay? As I was making mention, death penalty is not so convenient. Circumcision, not so convenient. Having to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year, not so convenient. Though, if you're used by Satan to create confusion and you tell someone that they're sinning because they eat swine, that's easy for you to follow. Just don't eat swine. And then you can be confusing. So you can easily follow Satan. And now for me, I have the enviable position where I don't eat anything unclean to my knowledge. And I as well eat meat. So I'm on the bold and powerful side of Romans 14, where I can speak boldly to what Paul said. And so Paul, this is one thing that Paul said in Romans 14. Is that Paul had and was persuaded. Okay. Now, this is a key saying when we start to delve deep. Okay. So it says here, in verse 14, I know and am persuaded by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. Okay. So meat does not destroy the work of God. Now, he was persuaded by the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay. And, you know, he would talk about how he uses a great plainness of speech in Jesus Christ and, you know, different things like this. He's saying he's persuaded by Jesus Christ and nothing is unclean of itself. We'll look at a place a bit later where we could suspect where he's getting that. And if nothing else, we'll find a sharp agreement too. And he's saying it doesn't destroy the work of God. So someone could come in and tell you there are specific meats that will cause you to sin in an abomination, and it would destroy the work of God then in that case. Now, one thing that has to be said that is fair, that if you were in Israel at the time of Jesus Christ walking, yes, swine would destroy the work of God because it would be presumptuous sin against the order. And there is a extremely horrid reading of what Jesus was doing in Mark 7, which I did a video against that. So I do uphold the Mosaic law until the cross as having to be done in its totality, and that Jesus certainly kept food laws, no doubt about that. Okay. So needless to say, as I've introduced my manner of life and doctrine, I want to be down the middle on this. Okay, I don't want to be on the antinomian side because antinomians today would have been your antinomians then. Okay. And they were, of course, condemned by Jesus, because if they were to break any least of the commandment and teach also, they'd be least in the kingdom, which is a idiom of underestimating, which goes back to the condemnation of Eli and his house to damnation of hell. So yeah, we don't want to be on that end of it to speak analytically on the Mosaic Law. But we don't want to be on the end of it either, where we're against what Paul is plainly saying in Romans 14. So he is talking about all meat, and that would include something sacrificed to idols, even. That he doesn't think it's unclean of itself, because he doesn't think the idol is anything of itself. So we'd have to go into some other things. Not going to touch too much on food sacrificed to idols. So let's start at Adam. All right. So I brought up, how there's two rungs here we got to get through. Now, if you're Adam and you're looking at the urge of him, of course, he had a natural proclivity to eat food. Nothing would have told him to eat an animal. So already we have the first man where nothing would tell him to eat an animal. And the reason why is because death was entirely that unnatural to him. Okay. As well, now he has God telling him to eat from the vegetation. Okay. So you already have this situation where if you would like to suggest that it is inherent that eating a pig is damnable sin, well, you're not on the beginning. So you're not there. It's just wrong already. Now, I understand there's going to be verses that come in about unclean things. So we're going to have to discern those. But that's where that's going to have to stay right now. Okay. And we know how impactful this is because you don't read about anyone eating an animal until God tells them to. So right now it's already over. It only took that long, and I spent a lot of time talking about other things. So it's already a done deal. I'm just going to go through it because I find it intriguing, and I want to be watered, so I got to water. And if I withhold too much, then it tends to my poverty. So I need to have a balance myself. Okay. Now, that puts me at the next level, because since then we see death of animals after sin, still no eating of them. Okay. One thing we do find, though, in Genesis 8, so when we go to Noah, and then so they got on the ark with the animals, and there was a difference that was being spoken to Noah that Noah must have learned from God. Okay, there's no possible way anyone can convince me that all these men, Enoch, Abel, of course, Adam was perfect. We're not necessarily going to trust Adam's thought process when he was in sin. He was trying to hide from Yehovah. So, but you get what I'm saying. Do you honestly think they knew the unclean from the clean? In fact, if you don't have Torah memorized, do you even know? Yeah, we know how important it is for you to know about the easy ones like swine. But do you know exactly what is clean and unclean? No, it's written down. That's how you would know. Okay. Now, in Noah's case, he did know because there was a difference in the totality of animals that he was working with. So God told Noah about that. Okay. Now, this is one thing I brought up about the Sabbath. We do see how God is able to hollow, consecrate, show something as pure versus not pure. And these are teaching tools in these lessons that God is using, of course. But we see how God can hollow something without man knowing exactly where God is going with it. Okay. And then not even that he is following it. He's just taking directions at that point. Whereas it's not the case when it comes to murder. We see how God spoke to Cain, that he's just assuming, Cain, rule over sin. I mean, if you do good, you'll be accepted. We just have to make this assumption together. I mean, what's going on here? Okay. Big difference. Okay. So then you get to Noah then offering sacrifice. Now he's using what is clean, of course. So we see, okay, God, he set me up to succeed here in worship. This is at the time of these sacrifices, which we're going to later see from men of God, where we wouldn't say it's about sin, certainly not Levitical style, which will play a role as I get there. But let's just say it's first and foremost about worship, which since Noah found grace and he was, ready to be flooded himself, certainly in his worship, it's going to be partly because he became regenerated and became heir to the righteousness that of faith and, served God in the ark and the preaching thereof and got off. And I mean, talk about being an heir and a type of it all. And so he's offering this sacrifice to God. So God gave him more clean. Okay. So already that makes sense. Now, one thing that will be something I don't know if you've pondered is that then he goes into, for us, the next chapter in Genesis 9, and now he's told of God. So this would be the inauguration of eating an animal. He's told of God that you can eat any food. He likens all food together at this point. So the vegetable to the meat, I mean, it's all the same. Okay. So it has to be all meat. There would be no way to get around this. Okay. Someone would have to say, because when they want to make the eating of swine something that you are just to know, like the back of your hand, that it is sin unto death or something, then they would have to say that God is saying you can eat all clean meat. Okay. Well, we know God didn't say it. It's not said like that. And now this is my next thing, because I had mentioned this. Like, would you know clean from unclean yourself without it being written down? And be honest. If you're looking at a pig and you're looking at, a lamb, I'm sorry. I mean, when I'm just looking at the animals, neither of them are appetizing to me. And then if they're cooked properly, both of them I find appetizing. I used to eat a lot of pork. Like I said, I don't eat any pork right now. Though, for me, if I'm having, prosciutto versus if I'm having, lamb chops, to me, it's no difference if it's cooked properly and it's, raised properly and it's not chemical laden, of course. Am I being unfair when I say that? I mean, is there any Judaizer that's honestly going to tell me they see a pig and a lamb and they can see a difference? I'm not talking about from preconception of different things you've read, and of course, the different indoctrinations that you have. I'm talking about being realistic. Like if you see both of those pieces of meat cooked and prepared, you wouldn't know a difference. Because, they might say, well, a pig is rolling around in dirt. What if it's not? And then what if they both, are slaughtered correctly and they're both prepared as pieces of meat cooked? It's got salt, okay? You wouldn't know a difference. So you see how on two levels you're fooled, okay? You're already fooled into thinking what you think at this point. So now I guess the only thing you're going to have left is to somehow agree that what I'm saying is correct and that somehow God is going to go past morality and to keep these ordinances around. You'll have to give in on all the points I'm making thus far and then say, okay, when Moses brought it in, it's sticking. Okay, so we're going to have to get through what Paul already said in Romans 14 and other places, that, someone who's seduced by a demon spirit teaches to abstain from meats. So, that can't work. So you're already in a really bad position. That's why I said the Isaiah card is the only card. And I'm going to get to that. But I've already got into it because, like I said, it's already without a moral standard. So this is one of those things. It is just how it is with the Mosaic Law. You either do it all or you don't. Okay. But I do want to keep going because I figure I might as well just go through the whole thing the best I can. Okay, so Noah can eat all of it. Now, when you think about Noah's position, it would have made more sense for Noah to eat the unclean meat. Because we know the vegetation would have been sparse at the time, because, it was a deluge, okay? And so he's got this food, he's got all these animals. He's already, prior to being told about eating them, doing worship with and using the animals for. Well, it would have made more sense for him to eat the unclean meat and keep the clean for worship. Now, I didn't have as much of them, but it also makes more sense to him that they're even there, because if God doesn't want him eating those, why even take them on the ark? You see what I'm saying? It would have been more sensible, I think, myself personally, to then just take 9 of the clean. I don't see why that doesn't make sense. But if he has a breakdown clean and unclean, and he has them take some unclean, well, use those for food and keep the other for worship. I don't know. If you have some addition to that or subtraction of that, I would like to hear, because that breakdown feels right. Okay. So the Noah part of it, I don't see how you're getting around that. All right. Now, we get to the law of Moses, okay, where now, of course, we do see a difference. I've already brought it straight out that you wouldn't know a difference without it being told you, okay? And there was a lot that God was helping Noah with to get those animals on board, and the numbering of them and which ones. So we know that God was behind that as the teacher, okay? So then he taught Moses, okay, different things. And there is, different things going on surrounding the animals, okay? One such verse, which shows there is a distinction between a group of people and what they may or may not eat. Okay, this one becomes, to me, the most important one that I'm aware of. Okay, so it teaches in Deuteronomy 14, verse 21, ye shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger that is in thy gates, that he may eat it. Or thou mayest sell it unto an alien, for thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk. So here, certainly God is not saying, within your holiness, go out of your way, even make money to cause someone to be unholy, abominable, or something. Of course not. What he's saying is you are separate. You have these laws. They don't. So you can give it to, a stranger hanging around the gate, or you could sell it to an alien. They're allowed to eat that. You cannot. So it's specific to a group of people. Now, if you are a Gentile today, you're not in Jerusalem, you're not keeping feasts. Maybe you have, quote unquote, the honorable feasts that you keep, but you are, needless to say, big on Sabbath and not eating swine. Okay. Well, what you'll find then, because I'll probably jump to the Council of Jerusalem next, you'll find then you are quite odd as a Gentile because you're not even in the land. I don't know if you have the credentials of being circumcised and keeping the Passover. And on top of this, it does not seem that you're willing to admit there were distinctives between peoples pertaining to what they were and were not allowed to eat. Because, that verse right there ties in, and that is about even clean, of course, because it would be a clean animal that dies of itself, because it wouldn't say an unclean, because that was already forbidden, of course. So there's even certain clean animals that, depending on the type of death, you weren't allowed to eat it, but someone else could. Okay. Again, that would be a clean food on the clean list. Okay. That would intensify the point. Now, I did a video about this some time ago now. It was about food sacrificed to idols. And we know what Paul said about that. It's controversial. And then we know that there's rebukes against doing it. The rebukes against doing it certainly would start with the doing it with the overall intentions about, and as well going along with their ceremonies. Okay. And doing it as like the children of Israel did. They sat down to eat, drink, and play and things. And, the seduction of Jezebel and Balaam in the churches. And Paul, you would incorporate things, of course, as well as said by Paul in the other direction that, you would be offending someone. Okay. The Council of Jerusalem, Paul is a partaker. Okay. It's not hard, okay, to get this right. They have a brevity to their conclusion, which I'm going to go through that. Because I'm going to tie it into that last verse that I read from the Torah, because that's what I believe I did in the past video. And because they mention an animal strangled, which I can't find that anywhere else in the scriptures as far as a way to connect it. I only see it from this council. It's mentioned a few times in the book of Acts, the council itself. Let's go ahead and read the verse. It says in Acts 15, verse 20, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. Now, okay. We know it would be entirely thoughtless for someone to say, okay, so I can do different things like I'm allowed to steal or allowed to lie, just make sure I don't do sexual sin. And then these three. Okay, so of course we know that's just outright stupidity if someone were to say something like that. So what's going on? Now, fornication, that just covers all sin because they're writing to believers. So that's just going to cover any sin against Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, these other three things, they're talking about keep yourselves from these due to your convenience, because now we have one of these interesting places where you have something written in the New Testament that's stricter than the Mosaic law in a sense. Because just prior in the Mosaic law, right, it talked about something that dies of itself, not to eat it, right? But that you could give it to a Gentile. Okay. Now, a Gentile who's part of the church, now they're being told, no, you can't take anything that dies of itself. Now, I have to make just one connection that would pertain to things strangled and as well to incorporate the blood too, because when something died of itself or was torn, this is mentioned like this in the text, that's where you would be skeptical concerning the blood, okay? Because they were told strictly to abstain from blood. Okay, Noah was told this as well, okay? Now, they're not telling you to abstain from unclean food, okay? But since they're telling you to stay away from strangled, to me, something that would die of itself or was torn by beasts, for whatever reason, it may have just been the way they were going through the conglomerates, they would talk about things strangled to cover the base of that. Okay. So in this case, a Gentile could have bought that or something similar. If you want to just say it's similar, that's fine. But now they're saying stay away from something strangled. So in that shift, it proves to us again. So it's just another proof that this is not something that is an inward sense. No, it's something that is being spoke out by someone in authority, whether it's Moses or an apostle, okay? And they're not telling you this just to have Paul go contradict it, okay, with how he's teaching, for example, to the Corinthians. And that he would teach the same way in every church. I mean, they're not saying it this way and then Paul says it another way and it's confusing. No. What they're saying is, okay, don't do these things for your convenience because it's just going to get you in trouble with the Judaizers. Okay? And that's why they're saying it. Because Paul did say what he said. Okay? And again, we have more examples about foods like, I don't want to branch off, but I brought up this verse, like something sacrificed to idols. Again, it can't be unclean of itself because Paul's saying when you go and buy the meat, don't ask any questions for conscience sake. Okay. So if that connection didn't make any sense, perhaps get in touch with me and we can talk about it. But the point was to show that there's a shift in orderings for different conveniences, okay? Because God has his law in Israel and he'll make use out of something that died of itself. I mean, the stranger can be fed from it. because it's not unclean of itself or something. It's not going to cause him immorality, and it's not poison. I mean, he can, go through a process and, cook it. Ceremonially speaking, for the Jew, it would work against some of the other things that they were being taught, and it keeps their ceremonies in an orderly fashion. The blood is the Lord's. Okay. Even the fat is the Lord's. Okay. That's just a different topic. Okay. And as far as precision goes with the fat expressly, but the point is there. Okay. So Paul's saying, all right, so it was one of the first things I read. Okay, he's persuaded by the Lord Jesus Christ that nothing is unclean of itself. So we do know that things were said to be unclean before Torah, during Torah. Now, what does Jesus say to Peter? And then how would that reflect into what Paul said? Okay. So, Peter and Jesus walked together. Here, Peter speaks of himself as someone who has not had anything unclean before. Notice how Peter would speak, even though Peter was a sinner at times, he would speak about being obedient. Okay. And if I go to, I guess I'll read at verse 10 of Acts 10. And on the morrow, that's verse 9. I guess I'll read this. As they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city, Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. And he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven opened, and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the four corners, and let down to the earth, wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air, all manner. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. This was done thrice, and the vessel was received up again into heaven. Now, Peter, in his particular situation, so he walks with Jesus, he keeps the Mosaic law, he doesn't eat anything unclean, neither does Jesus. It was the manner of the Jew that would do the law and live, right? Okay. So Jesus was a doer of the law and lived. Okay. As the law says. Jesus never sinned. Okay. And this is one place where Peter had not sinned. All right. So Peter, he is still under the influence of food laws. But by no means was Peter influenced. I'm not talking about he was in Judaizing at this moment. We know he had problems with that, though, at times. What I am saying, though, is that Peter would have no reason to suspect, and certainly in his current situation, that somehow the Gentiles had this uncleanness about them that was at all salvific, or when it came to interaction, because Jesus was around Gentiles. I mean, and Peter knew that. Okay. And Peter is aware of the teachings of the salvation of Gentiles. So, of course, someone that wants to adhere to food laws is going to say this is just about Gentiles. There's no way Peter would have understood it like that. Okay. Now, Paul, he does say, if someone thinks something is unclean, then to them it's unclean. So Paul would typically Paul was, you do it my way or get out. Okay. Yeah, that's how Paul was. And that was good that he was doing it like that. That's how I did it with Peter when it came to Judaizing. Paul left that part of it for you. Okay, go take a breath. Think about it yourself. Just don't dispute me. So he kept his bold charge. Don't tell me the way it works. I understand it. You don't. However, if you don't want to tell me the way it works, you want to keep it to yourself, then don't eat it. Okay. That's to me where I see Peter right now. So for whatever reason, and for me, one big reason would be that the struggles that Peter has, certainly he needed some extra help. So Jesus gave him some extra help right there, which, he needed to cling to with a better grip, as time went forward. And then Jesus just used Paul to break him down a little bit. Now, though, if you pick up on what is said, what God has cleansed, okay, so now it sounds to me as if Jesus is saying there is no distinction anymore in food, which now that gives us a jump all the way back to at least the time of Noah, where there was a distinction that was moving one way, and then still a distinction was there, but was being used another way in the Torah. And now, with all the sayings that we know that Paul was giving, how it's been nailed to the cross, now Jesus is just cutting out the distinction altogether. So this would be a place where you would use for the question, which I don't hear about it often, because this is more a convenient thing. So the Judaizers typically aren't doing sacrifices. There are going to be some movements out there doing sacrifices still. Okay. They're not maybe saying they're doing it for sins or something. Okay. But this would be a place where you would say, okay, if there's no distinction between clean and unclean, something like Noah was doing, we see maybe why he was doing it. Now, since God is cleansed, and we would point it to the cleansing of Jesus at this given time, not that I have any need or desire to offer animal sacrifices. It's just that when I read about Noah doing it, it doesn't affect me. And then I read something like this, it wouldn't even seem appropriate. And that's why we do see subtle things about circumcision too, why to me it's just a nulled out situation. I don't have any inclination to tell people to circumcise, although I know that you can if you want. So that would just lead me into one thing quick I wanted to speak about in Torah. Because as I had mentioned, how it would have made more sense for Noah to eat the unclean food and to use the clean for sacrifice. Now, in the Torah, though, you can't do it like that because they had to use the clean for sacrifice and only eat the clean meat. Now, that has a teaching too, because that has a teaching that they should have been that much more cognizant and aware about keeping themselves from sinning, because then they would have to use up their clean food for sacrifice in cases. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so I just thought I would add that. Okay, so that puts us now in the New Testament. We talked a little bit about things that Paul said. Food sacrificed to idols, we touched on that, how certainly there is condemnation on it. So it would depend on the mindset of the person. Paul's mindset was at total liberty. He spoke things maybe hard to be understood. Needless to say, we see a connection there with Peter, the one that said that about Paul. And, what God has cleansed, call not thou common. Okay. And so now we get to a point where we get to an end times position, okay? So it is playing a role, the time frame. We've seen a difference in time frame, okay? How God is dealing with his people. So when we go to the prophet Isaiah, okay, the clean and unclean distinction, though, comes back in the millennial kingdom. And this sacrifice comes back. I mean, Jesus is going to use sacrifices. So it goes to show us that the sacrifices can be used to point forward to Jesus and point back. Okay. So we see how if God can make this many different statutes surrounding the food, whether it be for nourishment or whether it be for worship, to somehow draw a flatline overarching conclusion that swine is sin of itself to eat is just something spaced out. I mean, it's not near, okay, from all the different things I've said. So you get to these places that you have in the prophet Isaiah in 65 and 66. For example, Isaiah 65, verse 4, which remain among the graves and lodge in the monuments, which eat swine's flesh, and broth of abominable things is in their vessels, which say, stand by thyself, come not near to me, for I am holier than thou. These are a smoke in my nose, a fire that burneth all the day. Okay, so say that the connection you would like to make, so this people that provokes God to anger continually to his face, that is sacrificing in gardens and burning incense upon altars of brick. Okay, so obviously no one's telling you to do that. And then you want to make a direct connection to the end times. Okay, so here's my thing with this, because this appears again in chapter 66. I'm not going to try to get out of this, by the way. I just want to go to this. I'll read this. Verse 3, he that killeth an ox is as if he slew a man. He that sacrificeth a lamb, as if he cut off a dog's neck. He that offereth an oblation, as if he offered swine's blood. He that burneth incense, as if he blessed an idol. Yea, they have chosen their own ways, and their soul delighteth in their abominations. I will choose their delusions. Okay, so here's the thing. You have to read down a bit in both cases to make what I guess to them is a straightforward connection that these are end times chapters, and that this would mean that in the end times, right, you'll have people maybe just eating swine or something. It's just that simple. They eat swine's flesh. Okay. And I thought at one point it talked about a mouse. I don't know. Could be somewhere. Let's see. I mean, swine's. Okay. Yeah, here it is. Verse 16. Isaiah 66. Well, let's read 15. For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination and the mouse shall be consumed together, saith the Lord. For I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. Okay. Now, when you read this, okay, I'll grant you that's end times. Okay. But what time? Well, to me, this sounds like the second coming of Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, a Judaizer might be excited to hear me admit that and say, see, it's as simple as, they're eating the swine's flesh and it's at the second coming of Christ. And you're telling me that it's okay to eat that where, Jesus, he's coming back to destroy people eating swine. Okay, so this is where you have the problem, because Jesus says all those different things about how Paul was saying, but he says what he says to Peter, what God has cleansed, right? So what Jesus is saying to Peter has to take you up to the second coming of the Messiah. So that therefore, what Jesus is coming to destroy are people eating foods sacrificed to idols. And you could see how they're in the monuments and the gardens, and they're going through all these filthy cultic rituals. And it's the table of devils. Okay, Paul is saying, Paul said what he said in places, but he's saying you cannot do that. Okay. But the food itself is not the problem, because Jesus said what he said. God has cleansed it. And we know how specific that is because, again, when you go into the millennial kingdom, there is now the distinction brought back. But it's not till then, because at the time now of the sojourning that we're in, there's no distinction. I mean, we have the distinction on paper, and of course we have to debate our cause with the Judaizers. We understand what the book says. But in this present time, what God has cleansed, we are not to call common or unclean. There's going to come a time if you endure till the end for the name of Jesus and you are one of those that goes into the nations, you escape. Assuming I was reading that correctly. But we all know that there's other places, of course, that people will, pass the judgment, the sheep, and of course the saints will be with him. That, okay, then the distinction comes back, but not until then. So going to that verse, all you're doing is setting yourself up against what Jesus said to Peter. And it's right in the direct verses that it's about sacrifices to the dead. Okay. It's blatant idolatrous practices going on, which you can find in harmony in Isaiah 1, which Isaiah 1, you would definitely think about the present time. Those upper places in the chapters certainly could have been used at the present time to come against some of the problems. That latter part, yeah, okay, granted, sounds end times to me, not a problem, okay? Needless to say, the way Jezebel was doing the thing in Thyatira, Balaam and Pergamos, I mean, they had the same problems years ago, okay? And in between all that, Paul is saying you can't take off the table of devils. For whatever reason, people want to go to these idolatrous events and take that table and go to church. And it's just something we see. I understand people celebrate pagan holidays. I don't. I get it, okay? It's just the devil's moved people to do both, okay? And I don't think the language is there to tell you it's not about people trying to do both. And the Antichrist is going to be a little bit of both. Okay. It's called the temple for a reason. Okay. And he's going to claim to be God in the temple of God. So he's going to usurp something that is Jesus with being a false Messiah, of course. He's not going to claim to be, following the Quran or something. So I hope that made sense, is that you're off. You're off there. It's about idolatry and someone that is worshiping devils, who is into food sacrifice to idols, who likes to be among graves and things like this. Well, do you think it's a big shock they're going to use swine? Because in that sense, it's mockery, right? You can look at that in history, okay? But as far as just the eating of it, well, it's not that simple in Isaiah. It's not meant to be that simple. It's not like I am telling you, well, it's read simply, and then I'm invoking Acts 10. I would still be correct with Acts 10, but it's not even read as simply eating swine. There's the whole thing around it and the whole, solemnity of the devils, right? It's their tables that are certainly being spoke of. It's not just your average guy, having a barbecue, eating sausage. You know what I'm saying? So, anyway, in Jesus' name, bless God.